Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy, and I'm your host, Joe Firestone. My topics for tonight are the protests, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Bill, and Biden's new red line. Is he really serious about it? Is he in it to win it? Or not? So, I'm going to start off by sharing an article on the protests. Well, actually, I'm going to start off by sharing a piece from Democracy Now! On the protests. So this was a piece, by Amy Goodman. She was interviewing a professor from Brown, by the name, of Omer, O-M-E-R. His last name, is Bartof. And he's an Israeli American. Let me see if I can find him here. Yeah. He's an Israeli American. He's a Holocaust survivor. And I'll take some time to go over what he has to say.
Crackdown on student-led Gaza solidarity encampments across U.S. campuses. We look now at how the Biden administration and several members of Congress have echoed intensifying accusations that the peaceful student-led pro-Palestinian protests are anti-Semitic. We're joined now by Omer Bartof. He's professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. His recent piece is headlined Weaponizing Language, Misuses of Holocaust Memory and the Never Again Syndrome. The professor recently visited the Student Gaza Solidarity Encampment at the University of Pennsylvania, sharing on social media a photograph with the Israeli historian Raz Segal and a message that said, quote, with Raz Segal at the UPenn encampment on April 26th, warm and open conversation about the perils of anti-Semitism and its current weaponization, unquote. Omer Bartof is also author of numerous books, including Genocide, the Holocaust, and Israel-Palestine, First-Person History in Times of Crisis. He's an Israeli-American scholar who's been described by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum as one of the world's leading specialists on the subject of genocide. He's joining us now from his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Professor Bartof, welcome back to Democracy Now! If you can talk about what's happening on these college campuses, what your visit to the UPenn encampment was like, as your own university, Brown University, students have set up an encampment, and their chant is from Columbia to Brown, we will not let Gaza down. And talk about what authorities are charging are the charges of anti-Semitism, although so many of those involved in these encampments are Jewish, with groups like Jewish Voice for Peace.
Good morning, Amy. Thank you for having me again. Well, look, I mean, my visit to UPenn, I was there with Raz Segal. We first actually gave a talk, both of us, about anti-Semitism and its current weaponization. And then we visited the encampment. It was a beautiful afternoon. There were very nice, good students there. We sat and chatted with them. We talked about anti-Semitism and about its current use. There was absolutely no sign of any violence, of any anti-Semitism at all. There were Jewish students there, there were Arab students there, there were all kinds of young people there, and the atmosphere was very good. The next day, I heard that the authorities of UPenn had decided to shut down the encampment. A couple of days earlier, I was passing by the green at Brown University, and again, there was an encampment there. Students were sitting there quietly, singing, playing the guitar. It was all very peaceful. And that same day, I heard from a faculty member who had visited that encampment that he had received an email from the dean of the faculty warning him that if he were to show up there again, measures would be taken. And now this issue is being debated at Brown, I believe today. This afternoon, there would be a meeting with the faculty, many of whom are, of course, like me, very upset by this kind of arbitrary action, which was taken without any consultation with faculty. So that's the kind of context. Look, I mean, obviously, anti-Semitism, as myself and many others have said, is a vile sentiment. It's an old sentiment. It has been used for bloodshed, for violence, and for genocide. And no one should condone it. And obviously, none of us would ever condone it. But it has also become a tool to silence speech about Israel. And that too has quite a history. And the current Israeli government, or rather the numerous governments under Benjamin Netanyahu, have been pushing this agenda of arguing that any criticism of Israeli policies, not least of Israeli occupation policies, this precedes, of course, events in Gaza, is anti-Semitic. And I've been listening to some of the interviews with Jewish students who feel threatened, and often it appears to me, and of course we don't have good research on that at the moment, but it appears to me that many of them feel threatened because they see a Palestinian flag, because they hear people calling for intifada. Intifada means shaking off. There's a very similar word in Hebrew for it, להתנער. It's what a dog does when it shakes off water. It's to shake off the occupation. And there are Jewish students, often who are influenced by the Israeli friends, who feel that that is threatening. But there's nothing threatening about opposing occupation and oppression. That is not anti-Semitism. You can agree with it or not. Even being anti-Zionist is not anti-Semitic. There are hundreds of thousands, if not more, of ultra-Orthodox Jews, including some who are in the Israeli government, who are anti-Zionist. But they're not anti-Semitic. They see themselves as the epitome of Jewishness and Jewish tradition. So there's politics and there's prejudice. And if we don't make a distinction between the two, then what we are actually doing is enforcing a kind of silence over the policies that have been conducted by the Israeli government for a long time and that ultimately culminated now in the utter destruction of Gaza.
Okay, so there it is. There's the conflation of anti-Semitism, okay, with anti-Zionism. Okay, the use, okay, of an aversion to anti-Semitism, okay, as a weapon to try to silence the opposition, okay, to Zionism, to try to silence the free speech, okay, of the opposition. Okay, so Bartov, who's an Israeli himself, okay, and who's Jewish. His first name is a well-known Hebrew name. He is very clear. He's, of course, an expert on the Holocaust. He's an expert, okay, on genocide. He's dedicated his life to opposing these things. And he is saying, do not conflate the two. Because to conflate them and to weaponize, anti-Semitism is to attack the free speech. That's what, and that means. So, going on. I guess I've forgotten again to share this. So let me share this on Facebook. So I hopefully get some more people here. Okay, there we go. So moving to the second piece I wanted to show you. This piece is from Common Dreams.
That was pretty interesting.
Well, thank you. I thought it was also pretty interesting. This article is going to be pretty interesting too. That was Bonnie, of course, telling me that was pretty interesting. And this is an article by Robert Freeman from Common Dreams on May 5th, so 4 days ago. 3 simple tests to weigh the protesters' legitimacy. For example, the Israeli government is murdering tens of thousands of innocent, defenseless women and children. Okay, is that acceptable? If it is not, then the students' protests are legitimate. That's just a tagline from the article. But going to the full article, the media is doing all it can to delegitimize the students protesting Israel's genocide in Gaza. And the U.S.'s complicity in it. And yes, I know the World Court has not yet rendered a verdict that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. It just talked about there being a probability of that, and that it was plausible to investigate it. And they haven't come up with a decision yet, but with Israel continuing to do the things it was doing before the court case that we saw, it becomes more and more likely with each passing day that they will find that Israel has been committing genocide in Gaza, or that is my opinion anyway. Going on with the article, and the U.S. complicity in it, it is a sign of just how fragile and threatened is the existing order that promotes the genocide. Besides diverting attention from the genocide itself, the media is calling the protests, quote, pro-Palestinian, unquote, instead of, quote, anti-genocide, unquote. That framing itself is revealing of the need to obfuscate. The media are also suggesting the students are being led by outside agitators, that they are anti-Semitic, even, quote, terrorists, unquote. Anything except the fact of the genocide. There are 3 simple tests we can conduct to answer whether the student protests are legitimate. They start with this. Quote, does a government, any government, have the right to murder tens of thousands of its own innocent, defenseless women and children, unquote? Because that is what is happening, okay, in Gaza. And you might remark, okay, at this point, well, the women and children that they're murdering are not their own women and children, but of course, Israel is the occupier, okay, of Gaza. It is, as the occupier, the state with the responsibility to create order, okay, in Gaza. Instead of creating order, it is murdering tens of thousands of the innocent, defenseless women and children uh, uh, in Gaza. Going on, the Israeli government is murdering tens of thousands of innocent, defenseless women and children, and it is doing so without any remorse and with the seeming conviction that it's going to get away with it. Impunity. Is that acceptable? If it is not, then the students' protests are legitimate. A second simple test, okay, of the legitimacy of the students is this. Quote, should a government be able to ethnically cleanse millions of people from land their ancestors lived on for 2,000 years so that it, the government, can steal that land and keep it as its own, unquote? Because that is undeniably what is happening in Gaza. Israel was granted 55% of Palestine by UN Resolution 181 in 1948. I thought the date of that resolution was 1947, but anyway, it took 78%, making itself immediately in violation of international law. And then in 1967, it took the rest. I don't know if I entirely agree with that. In response to the Israeli declaration, okay, of independence, the Israelis were attacked by 5 Arab nations, and they had to fight. Okay, in the process of the fighting, they took over some more territory at that time, getting to the 78%. It's also relevant, perhaps, to mention that the 55% of Palestine, quite a lot of that 55%, perhaps off the top of my head, 50 or 60% of it, was the Negev desert. The other 45% that was left, okay, for the Palestinians was most of the fertile land, okay, in Palestine. In the, some narrow strips, okay, of land, okay, and then, of course, the Negev desert. Okay, whereas the Palestinians were left with the West Bank, those other areas which the Israelis illegally took over. Okay, and with the Gaza Strip. Okay, so that partition deal was actually not such a bad deal for the Arabs, okay, at the time. But going on, yes, he's certainly right. Then in 1967, it took the rest. That's why the Palestinians now live in what are termed, quote, occupied territories. Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, those were all seized by an illegal and still illegal military occupation. Is that acceptable? If it is not, then the students' protests are legitimate. Okay, I have to say, of course, that I don't think it was acceptable or is acceptable for the government of Israel to be able to ethnically cleanse the millions of people in Gaza, which they apparently are trying to do. I don't think it's acceptable for the Israelis to have occupied the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza uh, since 1967. What is that now? 57 years. That is not acceptable. A third simple test of the legitimacy of the students is this: should the U.S. government be assisting in this, the most open and notorious ethnic cleansing and genocide of the 21st century, unquote? Because that is undeniably what is happening in Gaza. And here I have to agree with the inference. No, that is not acceptable. The U.S. government is doing everything it can, providing money, weapons, diplomatic cover, military cover, also media cover, to help the government of Israel murder tens of thousands of innocent, defenseless women and children. And he shouldn't also forget the men, because the men are pretty defenseless also. Last time I looked, Gaza had no regular army. It has a resistance force, but all the men in Gaza are not in the resistance force. So there are a lot of innocents who are males, as well. Anyway, the author asks, is that acceptable? If it is not, then the student protests are legitimate. And I agree there too. Those are the only three tests you need to ask to determine whether the student protests are legitimate. The reason the students are being savage in the media is because their protests are spotlighting, as the media itself will not, the horrific immorality of what Israel is doing. The craven complicity of the U.S. government in helping them do it, and the deep entwinement of so much of U.S. society in these immoral, craven acts: the government, the universities, the military-industrial complex, the media, and more. And to be clear, it is not anti-Semitic to say this. Remember, what what Omer Bartov had to say. Professor Bartov. It is not anti-Semitic to criticize the government, of Israel, and especially not on the three grounds that the author offers here. It is not anti-Semitic to say that the government cannot murder tens of thousands of innocent, defenseless women and children. It is not anti-Semitic to state that no government has the right to ethnically cleanse millions of native people from their land, so that it can steal their land and keep it for itself. It is not anti-Semitic to say that the U.S. government should not be helping any government, commit such savagery. The students are one of the few classes of actors remaining in the society that are not bought or sold out. Congress is laughably, tragically bought by money from the American-Israeli Political Action Committee, AIPAC. The travesty is that everybody knows this, but is not supposed to say it, and most do not. But it is not anti-Semitic to say it. It is simply a clinical description of how money and power works in a society that has abandoned its ideals and principles and worships only money, and power. And I must say, I have to agree with that as well. The universities are bought by their dependence on large donations from wealthy Jewish donors, which we saw when the presidents of Harvard and Penn were run out of their jobs because wealthy Jewish donors demanded their heads. And no, it is not anti-Semitic to say that. It is simply a clinical description of how money and power works in a society that has abandoned its ideals and principles and worships only money and power. In these ways, as it was in the Vietnam War, the students may yet be the society's salvation. And I have to add here, okay, before I go on, that I do have, okay, an inherent bias, because during the civil rights movements of the 1960s, the anti-war movements, okay, of the 1960s, I was a student demonstrator. I was a protester, a student protester. My protests went all the way back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was in the streets for that. I was in the streets for the civil rights movement. I was in the part of the Vietnam teaching. I was there for all of that. So I am biased. I think that student protests are a legitimate exercise of free speech. And I will think that to my dying day. Back then, the U.S. government was, quote, bombing back to the Stone Age, unquote, a society of pre-industrial age rice farmers who simply wanted to be left alone to choose their own form of government, which the U.S. government was determined they would not be allowed to do. 4 million Vietnamese were killed against 58,000 Americans. That's a 69-to-1 kill ratio. That's not a war. That's an industrialized slaughter. It's the same in Gaza today, except worse. The Israeli government has herded the Palestinians into what is called, quote, the largest open-air concentration camp in the world, unquote, and is massacring them with surgically targeted industrial abandon. It is the Holocaust redux, lacking only the gas chambers. And this time, all the world is watching. Again, all the world is watching, not doing anything about it, just watching. I had to add that because it's true. Those nations loudly condemning this Holocaust are doing very little to prevent it. There are some isolated instances. The Houthis, okay, in Yemen, Hezbollah, okay, in Lebanon, some resistance from the Iraqis and the Iranians, some from the Syrians. But it's not very direct. The Arab nations should all be up in arms over this. Should be doing everything they physically can to stop it. And all the great powers, and the United Nations too. This time all the world is watching, but they're still doing very little about it. I added that to the article. The author doesn't discuss that. The problem the students pose to the powers that be is that they will not submit to and recycle the officially sanctioned narrative, the OSN, which holds that, quote, Israel has the right, okay, to defend itself, unquote. Israel does have the right to defend itself within its internationally recognized legal borders. Gaza is not within those borders. It is illegally occupied territory, so that, quote, right to defend itself, unquote, does not apply. Let's be clear. Israel is the fourth mightiest military power in the world. For more than 7 decades, it has been carrying out the ethnic cleansing, which it is now hoping to finish. Its actions have nothing to do with defense It is simply slaughtering tens of thousands of innocent, defenseless women and children so that it can steal their land. And again, I say, many of the men are defenseless there. What is it estimated? The forces of Hamas constitute what? 30,000 people, 40,000 people at most. There are many more males than that in Gaza. Thank God for the students back in the Vietnam era. They pulled the U.S. back from an abyss of apocalyptic violence, suicidal immorality, and industrialized genocide. We can only hope that the students today can do the same. But that depends on our willingness to listen to simple truths and the courage to abide by the obvious answers. Whether we have such willingness and the courage to do what the answers compel is not at all clear. What is clear is that the media will do everything it can to prevent us from arriving at the right answers and the right action. And so there's a condemnation of the media too. So, next, I want to turn to, I guess I'm going to go over some comments first. D is here. Hello, D. D was the first one here. And he says, hi, Joe Pedia. How's Bonnie? Kids are at the park chasing fireflies. Gone till dark. Yay. Well, Andy, Bonnie is fine. Before we did this stream, we went for a walk in the hallway for her to practice with her cane. She's doing very well. She still has to has to develop endurance when she uses the cane, but she's getting much better at using it, in the proper way. And I'm sure as we continue the exercise, as the days gone by, she'll be fine. And sometimes she's getting around in the apartment. She doesn't even think about it. She starts to do things without using the cane. So that's a very hopeful sign too.
Thank you for your concern.
Andy says, hey, I have multiple personality disorder, so there are 6 of us here. Laugh out loud. Andy says, grabbing some pizza rolls, pigging out. Nom, nom, nom. Evelina says, one group of pro-Palestinian students were expelled, then called outside agitators. Can you believe it? Yeah, I can believe it. These folks will do anything. So going on, I wanted to get to the issue of the act passed by the House of Representatives. The HR 6090, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act of 2023. It was passed by the House on May 1st of 2024 by a very large majority, 320 to 91. It was received in the Senate on May 2nd, 2024. No other actions on this act have been taken since then. So I want to disabuse people of the idea that this bill has passed the Congress. It hasn't passed the Congress. It's not the law of the land. The other day, Scott Ritter was saying that he thought, it was the law. Ray McGovern said, on another live stream, that he thought it was the law. No, folks. It hasn't passed yet. Thank God for that. Since it's been in the Senate for 7 days now, something must be going on with it. There must be some things in the background going on with this. There may be some senators who don't want to pass this bill because they understand quite well, that it embodies a conflation of anti-Semitism with opposition to Zionism or criticism, okay, of Israel. So next, I want to share another article from Common Dreams. If I can find it, excuse me when I try to find it. I have a lot of tabs open, so sometimes it can take a while. Here it is. Common Dreams again. This one is about the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. The caption is, protest posters say that the criticism of Israel is not equal to anti-Semitism. They hung at Harvard University in Cambridge, Mass. On December 12, 2023. Criticism of Israel isn't anti-Semitism. Calling it genocide is not anti-Semitism. And these posters were put up by Harvard, MIT, UPenn, Jews for Palestine. +800 Jewish professors urge Biden and the Senate to oppose, quote, dangerous, unquote, anti-Semitism bill. Yes, it's still a bill. It's not an act until it passes both the House and the Senate and is signed by the president. It's not a law until then. Quote, criticism of the state of Israel, the Israeli government, policies of the Israeli government, or Zionist ideology is not in and of itself anti-Semitic, unquote, reads a new letter. I think that should be newsletter. This is by Julia Connolly of Common Dreams on May 9th, 2024. A Dartmouth University professor who once served as the school's head of Jewish studies and was violently arrested at a Palestinian rights protest last week was among more than 800 Jewish educators who'd signed a letter as of Thursday demanding that lawmakers and U.S. President Joe Biden oppose a bill claiming to combat anti-Semitism. The Awareness of Anti-Semitism Act, said the letter, would actually, quote, amplify the real threats Jewish Americans already face, unquote, by conflating anti-Semitism, I should say, quote again, conflating anti-Semitism with a legitimate criticism, okay, of Israel. And all criticism of Israel, whose content is not itself anti-Semitic, is legitimate criticism of Israel. In a free society, criticism by definition is legitimate. With very few exceptions defined by law. And those are not specified in the First Amendment of the Constitution. The bill, which was passed by the Republican-controlled House last week, over the objections of 70 progressive Democrats and 21 Republicans, would codify the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's, IHRA, working definition of anti-Semitism, which includes, quote, targeting of the state of Israel, unquote, and, quote, quote again, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. The Awareness of Anti-Semitism Act, which could soon be taken up by the Senate, would require the Department of Education to consider the group's working definition when determining whether harassment is motivated by anti-Semitism. The professors noted that the working definition has been, quote, internationally criticized, with more than 100 civil society organizations, including some Israeli groups, calling on the United Nations last year to reject the IHRA's interpretation because it has been, quote, misused, unquote, to shield Israel from legitimate criticism. Quote, we hold various opinions on Israel, reads the letter. Quote again, whatever our differences, we oppose the IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism. If imported into federal law, the IHRA definition will delegitimize and silence Jewish Americans, among others, who advocates for Palestinian human rights or otherwise criticize Israeli policies. Okay. I also must say, I have to say, if this gets into law, someone is going to immediately challenge it. Probably it's going to be a Jewish American. They'll challenge it. It'll be taken to court. It'll go up the line to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is sure to declare this law unconstitutional. Even the current Supreme Court, full of tyrants, full of fools, will surely see the conflict this law has with the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The professors pointed out the irony that by using the IHRA definition, which also includes, quote, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel, unquote, than their own home countries, the bill, quote, hardens the dangerous notion that Jewish identity is inextricably linked to every decision of Israel's government, unquote. I'm here to tell you my Jewish identity is not so linked. Quote, far from combating anti-Semitism, this dynamic promises to amplify the real threats Jewish Americans already face, unquote. The letter reads, Annalise Orlek, the Dartmouth professor who was arrested last week, and by the way, Annalise is a European name, was joined by other Jewish academics, including City University of New York professor Peter Beinart and Professor Emeritus Avishai Margalit of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, in signing the letter. Orlek, a labor historian, told ABC affiliate WMUR after her arrest that she hopes Dartmouth and other schools that have cracked down on and condemned pro-Palestinian protests in recent weeks will, quote, stop weaponizing anti-Semitism, unquote. There was a tweet, by Raphael Shimunov, Jewish Dartmouth professor at Annalise Orlek 1, 65, says, yeah, I felt unsafe on campus, but not because my students and their Palestine protests, because of police who body slammed me on the ground and arrested me for protecting kids. And calls out New Hampshire governor. Forgive me while I pull up this tweet. At Chris Sununu, spreading misinformation about protests being anti-Semitic. Sununu, of course, is a Republican. His father was rather notorious for various things, and he is not exactly the most moderate of Republicans either. I'm not going to play the video. I'm going to go back to the article. The professors urged political leaders who are, quote, earnestly concerned with anti-Semitism to quote, join hundreds of Jewish scholars from across the globe who have endorsed alternative definitions of anti-Semitism, such as those contained in the Nexus document or Jerusalem Declaration. Unlike the IHRA definition, these documents offer meaningful tools to combat anti-Semitism without undermining Jewish safety and civil rights by insulating Israel from legitimate criticism, unquote. When the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act was passed by the House last week, Jewish-led Palestinian groups were among those that condemned the proposal. Biden has angered pro-Palestinian rights groups by suggesting the campus protests that have spread across the U.S. in recent weeks, with students and faculty demanding an end to U.S. support for Israel as it bombards Gaza, are inherently anti-Semitic. Quote, criticism of the state of Israel, the Israeli government, policies of the Israeli government of Zionist ideology is not in and of itself anti-Semitic, unquote, reads the professor's letter, which was first publicized on Wednesday. Quote, we accordingly urge our political leaders to reject any effort to codify into law a definition of anti-Semitism that conflates anti-Semitism with criticism of the state of Israel, unquote. And that's that piece. And of course, that law is a threat to freedom of speech here, okay, in the United States. And I can't let it pass also that the repression of free speech on the campuses of the United States is in violation of the First Amendment all across the United States. The police repression practiced by the campus police and the external police that have been called in by authorities represents wholesale violation of the First Amendment. The people who have done this need to be jailed. We can't keep allowing these wholesale violations of the First Amendment to take place. It's been going on now for a very long time. It makes the First Amendment to the Constitution a dead letter. Violations of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly all over the place. We say we have a democracy. We increasingly act like we have a police state. We need to stop that. Yesterday, going on. Andy says, hey, D, great to see you. Andy says, hi, Kay. Andy says, wow, 800 plus. Those professors are more pro-Palestinian than our corrupt Congress. Well, that's not too hard, but yes, they are more pro-Palestinian. But actually, they're more free speech, pro-free speech, and pro-civil liberties and civil rights than the members of Congress who have taken an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. And yet they violate that Constitution with the legislation they passed. This is not the first time, and it won't be the last. Kay Ryan says, hi, Andy. So, to get to the last piece for tonight, this relates to our President of the United States, Joe Biden. Another Common Dreams piece by Brett Wilkins on May 8th. Biden, quote, moving the goalpost, unquote, with threat to withhold bombs from Israel. Quote, now Israel has a green light to destroy Rafah in slow motion, unquote, said one critic. Again, this was written by Brett Wilkins, part of the permanent staff of Common Dreams. Well, some Palestine defenders on Wednesday welcomed U.S. President Joe Biden's threat to withhold bombs and artillery shells from Israel if it launches a major invasion of Rafah. Critics noted that an invasion is already underway and accused the American leader of walking back a previous, quote, red line, unquote, warning against an Israeli assault on the southern Gaza city. So, in other words, he walks back a previous red line and he defines, okay, another red line. But I understand it's not just a threat at this point, that he does seem to be withholding some of the high tonnage bombs already. Okay, but at this point, he's just saying that if they make a major invasion, whatever a major invasion is, he's going to stop the shipment of bombs, okay, and artillery shells from Israel. I, of course, will believe it when we see it. But he said for the first time that he'll stop sending bombs, artillery shells, and other arms to Israel if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu orders a major invasion of Rafah, where more than 1 million Palestinians forcibly displaced from other parts of the embattled Gaza Strip are sheltering alongside around 280,000 local residents. Referring to Israel's use of U.S.-supplied 2,000-pound bombs, which can destroy an entire city block, and which I think they probably really need to use to get to the Hamas tunnels, perhaps, and have been used in some of the war's worst atrocities, Biden told CNN's Aaron Burnett that, quote, civilians have been killed in Gaza as a consequence of those bombs and other ways in which they go after population centers. Trita Parsi tweeted, actually very predictably, that's not a criticism, define, quote, launch, unquote, quote, major, unquote, and, quote, invasion, unquote. Biden says he will stop sending bombs and artillery shells to Israel if they launch major invasion, okay, of Rafah. Even the U.S. military, which has killed more foreign civilians than any other armed force on the planet since the end of World War II, won't use 2,000-pound bombs in urban areas. But Israel does, including when it launched a strike to assassinate a single Hamas commander by dropping the munitions on the Jabalia refugee camp last October, killing more than 120 civilians. If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah to deal with the cities, unquote, Biden said Wednesday. Israeli forces have already gone into Rafah, and it was reported Tuesday Biden was taking the unusual step of delaying shipments of 2 types of Boeing-made bombs to Israel to send a message to the country's far-right government. It was, however, a mixed message, as the president also earlier in the day reaffirmed his support for Israel's war on Gaza, which the International Court of Justice said is, quote, plausibly, unquote, genocidal in a preliminary ruling in January. And the IMEU, which I'm not sure what that is, not sure what IMEU stands for, probably International Middle East, maybe Union, but That's a guess. The Israeli military isn't waiting to invade Rafah. They're already there with 14 plus K children dead, man-made famine, and an ongoing genocide since October. Where exactly is at POTUS's red line? President Biden could end the bloodshed today. Why won't he? Yes, very many people, including Pepe Escobar and Scott Ritter, say that he could end the bloodshed today with a phone call to Bibi. Critics noted the shifting and subjective language used by Biden, who previously said that any Israeli invasion of Rafah would constitute a, quote, red line, unquote, resulting in unspecified consequences. Quote, he said invading Rafah was a red line. Israel invaded Rafah anyway, bombing buildings, burning and crushing children to death, unquote. A political analyst, Omar Badar, said on social media, quote, Biden is now moving the goalpost by adding a completely subjective descriptor, quote, major, unquote. Now Israel has a green light to destroy Rafah in slow motion. During the course of the 7-month Israeli assault on Gaza, which has killed, maimed, or left missing more than 124,000 Palestinians, Biden has said Israel has killed, quote, too many civilians, unquote, with its, quote, indiscriminate bombing, unquote, even as he pushed for more and more military aid for the key ally. Wednesday's interview came on the heels of Biden's approval of a $14.3 billion emergency military aid package to Israel. Multiple moves to sidestep Congress to fast-track arms assistance, nearly $4 billion in previously authorized annual military aid, and diplomatic cover in the form of several UN Security Council vetoes, reporting that the Biden administration will delay a highly anticipated report on whether Israel is using military aid in compliance with international law, also drew backlash Tuesday from human rights advocates. Referring to Israel's U.S.-funded anti-missile system, Biden continued his supportive rhetoric during Wednesday's CNN interview, telling Burnett that, quote, we're going to continue to make sure Israel is secure in terms of Iron Dome and their ability to respond to attacks, unquote. But the president added that Israel's use of devastating weaponry against civilians is, quote, just wrong, unquote, and that, quote, we're not going to supply the weapons and artillery shells, unquote. Some peace groups welcome Biden's threat to withhold bombs and artillery shells from Israel, even while urging him to do more to stop his allies' genocidal onslaught. If not now, tweeted, pausing bomb transfers is a step in the right direction, but at POTUS shouldn't have waited until Israel had already massacred 30K plus Palestinians. Biden, halt weapons transfers to the Israeli military now, in caps, to prevent further massacres and mass graves in Rafah or anywhere else in Gaza. And the IMEU, oh, that was a quote tweet, okay, of a tweet by the IMEU, which said, breaking, another mass grave has been discovered in the courtyard of Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza, containing the bodies of dozens of Palestinians, including doctors, nurses, women, children, and patients. Here's what you need to know. So that was the tweet that was quote tweeted by If Not Now. Quote, Biden's statement is as necessary as is overdue. Jewish Voice for Peace Executive Director Stephanie Fox said in a statement, the quote again, the U.S. already bears responsibility for months of catastrophic devastation. The nearly 40,000 Palestinians that the Israeli military has killed, the 2 million Palestinians being intentionally brought to the brink of famine, and the decimation of all universities and almost every hospital in Gaza, unquote. Quote, today's statement shows that Biden can no longer ignore the will of the majority of Americans who want a permanent ceasefire, release of all hostages, and an end to U.S. complicity in Israeli war crimes, unquote. Fox added. I would like to see a statement like that from another Fox, specifically Amaryllis Fox Kennedy, the daughter-in-law of Robert Kennedy. I would like to see a statement like that from that Fox. Anyway, so I'll take your comments now. Andy Candy says, good point, Joe. And Andy says, we can stick a fork in Biden the butcher because he's done. He may be done from an electoral standpoint, but he's not done from giving orders. He's not done from making decisions. He's not done from creating disasters for U.S. foreign policy. And he won't be done with that until January 20th of 2025. So there is that. We also have to make sure that we can stick a fork in Trump because he's done also. That's what we have to make sure of both. Both of them have to be done because we can't have either of them, okay, in the presidency. Okay, so that's all for me tonight. I am now going to go over to Dee's show, which is starting right now. Hopefully, okay, I will see you all there. I'm sure she will have a good show. And I'll be fully participating as usual. So good night. I'll be back tomorrow night, okay, at 8 o'clock with another revealing stream. Have a great night. See you later.